Hello everyone. For those I haven't met yet, my name is Milica Prokic. I'm an environmental historian. I study former Yugoslavia and the Southwestern Balkans, their environments, their societies and their interrelations. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to give you this talk from the Carson Center. And I feel very lucky to be here in Munich as a part of this community. And I'm very, very thankful that I was invited into it. Of course, I would much prefer to give this talk today to you with all of us present in the same room. But this is unfortunately not possible right now because of this increasingly isolating pandemic reality. But then we do have the online connection. And I guess that this strange state of being isolated and connected at the same time might be a good segue into the topic of my talk today. And the topic of my talk are islands. And if you think about islands, really, apart from them being isolated, they're always interconnected as well. They always embody this contradiction. I'm going to tell you about one island in particular, a prison island called Goli otok, off the coast of Croatia in the Adriatic Sea. This island was the case study that I worked on for my PhD thesis. And in my PhD thesis, I explored the embodied interrelationships between the group of political prisoners and the island of their incarceration, Goli otok, in Tito's Yugoslavia in the late 40s and the early to mid 50s. And I'm now working on a book about it, and in this book I will explore some of these ideas further, and I will expand some of them. And I'll tell you a little bit about this today as well. But before I tell you about the case study of my island, I feel like I need to situate this small rock in the Adriatic within the vast archipelago of the world islands, the global archipelago. And if we imagine that all the islands in the world are part of one global archipelago, it can help us think about how the islands are connected as much as they're separated by whatever waters surround them. And in this vast and diverse global archipelago, we can talk about hyper-connected islands, big island states, big mighty trade ports like Singapore or Hong Kong. Or we can talk about islands whose endemic species or unique environments came precisely out of their isolation, like Galapagos with their giant tortoises, or Komodo, home to giant monitor lizards, or tiny elephants who are now extinct, but who once lived in Malta. So we can talk about gigantism or dwarfism in animals just because their habitats were islands. Or we can talk about this island off the coast of Brazil with the snakes who evolved the venom that's 5 times more potent and quicker and deadlier than of their cousins in the mainland. And the reason why is that these snakes mainly have birds for food, so they have to be quick and deadly. So it is no wonder that some scientists, Darwin included, have long seen islands as laboratories of natural processes, of evolution, endemism, and extinction. Scientists like Wilson and MacArthur, for example, also see islands as objects, discrete objects labeled by names, as they noted in their seminal book in the 60s. Islands can also be seen as bodies by some scholars. If you're a new materialist, for example, like Stacey Alamo, who says that all entities that exist, regardless of scale, are bodies. From particles to blood corpuscles to human bodies or mountains or islands, they're all bodies. Islands are definitely places in the way in which phenomenologists understand the term, and they understand the term in this way. Spaces where life happens are places. And of course, we know about places where lives occur only if we have a human story told to us in the language that we can comprehend. So necessarily, over this global archipelago of islands, or intertwined with this archipelago of islands, is also an archipelago, a vast global archipelago of island stories. So we have imagined islands and island worlds, like Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, for example. or the Treasure Island, or that bleak fiction in The Lord of the Flies where something savage and disturbing happens on an island to a group of stranded boys. Islands are also sites of leper colonies and insane asylums, or places which emperors and hegemons use to exile whoever they want to get rid of. Or maybe, indeed, the places where they themselves end up when they fall out of power and out of grace, like Napoleon did on Elba or at St. Helena. And to sum up, so islands are total entities. They're discrete parcels of environment. They're isolated yet connected. They're imagined and embodied, narrated and tangible. And each is exceptional in their own way. They range from honeypots to hellholes, as geographer David Lowenthal noted. And the island I'm going to tell you about today certainly belongs to this darker register of hellholes. So the title of my talk is Goli Otok, Barren Island, Nature and Narratives of the Infamous Yugoslav Prisonscape. It's a mouthful, but we're going to unpack it word by word, together with all the parentheses and the quotation marks. And we're going to start with the name of the place. The word Goli in the languages of former Yugoslavia means naked or barren. And that adjective perfectly describes the terrain of the island. Located in the sea strait in the Adriatic Sea off Croatian coast, made of limestone, it is a small island of about 4.5 square kilometers. It looks almost like a lunar surface, as you can see, but the lunar-looking surface heated by intense Mediterranean sun for about 200 days a year. And as you can imagine, apart from prisoners who were brought there in the mid-20th century, it has not been inhabited by humans in the known past. So that's the first word in the name, barren. The second word, otok, apart from island, also means swelling, as in a painful bodily swelling, a result of an injury or a disease maybe. And this word in the name is also quite painfully appropriate for this island, for in the memory of the former Yugoslav country, this is still a very painful spot. And this is especially true if we talk about the island's past between 1949 and 1956, when it was a site of a political prison and labor camp commandeered by the UDBA, State Security Service of Tito's Yugoslavia. The imprisoned on Goli Otok between 1949 and 1956 were both men and women, the so-called Cominformists. The so-called Cominformists were Yugoslavs, or people living in Yugoslavia at the time of Tito-Stalin dispute that resulted in the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Cominform by Stalin. So the Cominformists were members of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Many of them were former partisans, anti-fascist guerrilla fighters from the Second World War, and even veterans from the Spanish Civil War. At first, the Cominformists, or locally Ibeovci, were people who openly sided with Stalin and agreed with some aspects of the document called the Resolution of Cominform from the 1948, in which Stalin expressed his grievances towards Yugoslav leadership. And then there were those who were only accused for agreeing or siding with Stalin on this, and by that token against Tito. And they were then joined by the non-party folk, intelligentsia, students, and even high school pupils who criticized Titoism in any way, even jokingly. And as the Yugo-Soviet tensions intensified and the relations deteriorated in the following months, in the increasing atmosphere of fear, of anonymous tips and more arrests, where people would now get arrested sometimes for a comment or a joke, or sometimes for the reasons they did not know themselves, many were sent away to undergo the so-called political re-education through the so-called socially beneficial labor. This political re-education here meant forcing people to revise political stances through extreme bodily pressures, one of which was the forced labor in extremely long and exhausting shifts in the island's stone quarries. So when we talk about Goli Otok as a prison in this particular period, we also necessarily talk about something that Ana Antić, a historian of psychiatry, rightfully called the unique culture of violence. And I will also add that Goli Otok at this time was the environment of profound pain and human suffering. And to approach this environment of the prison island and all the interrelations within it, we need to start with the human factor, although the whole story is not reducible only to human relations. One of the main factors in human terms was the signature feature of the prison system, the self-managed component of political re-education. Namely, in order to graduate from the so-called re-education, the prisoners were forced to physically compel their peers into revising their political stances as well, through a series of various pressures, of course, and abuse. Now, some of these people, as mentioned, were former partisan fighters, both skilled in combat and ready to fight for their political beliefs. Some of them were legendary communist veterans. For example, in the male camp was Mirko Marković, a veteran of both Second World War and the Spanish Civil War, where he was the commander of the American Washington Battalion, so a commander and also good friend of Ernest Hemingway. So it wasn't easy to push these people into revising their politics just by beatings, simply. The prison authorities worked on destroying any chance of camaraderie among the prisoners as well. So they feel alone and isolated and unable to maybe orchestrate a mutiny. And this was done by infiltrating their collaborators into convict groups, who then started this vicious circle of mutual beatings, abuse, torture, and other pressures. And because increased pressures were needed, as some of the convicts refused to yield, the violence escalated very quickly. And by the time the non-party folk, the civilians, the students, and the really young people, and I'm talking about people in early teens, by the time they came to the island, the violence was in the full swing, both in the male and the female camp. And this extreme human harshness came about at this island or place or entity that these people were forced to inhabit. Apart from being extremely hot, as we said, and bleached and sharp, as you can see on this picture, it is also exposed to extremely strong gusts of the Bura wind. So it is not just a hot place in the summer days, it's also an extremely cold place in the winter nights. There is no drinkable water on the island. It is a place of extremes. Add to this fuming waves of the often stormy sea, salinating its terrain, and combine it with a picture of this whitish, barren, savage rock. You can see how it did not inspire anything good in the people who arrived there at the first glance. And I will quote here one of the former prisoners. "I remember my arrival to the island, onto the white and reddish rocks everywhere around, the terrifying bareness of the island. Whoever was used to gladly wandering through the field and in the woods would be all the more aware of the island's dead neglect at that moment, of its desolation and its deadness. Void and ugly indeed would be their soul, dried, dead from the divides and doubts, fears and hopelessness, like that island itself from the winds and the waves." Indeed, this former inmate described this place where the soul goes to die, and for which, anecdotally, for this island, Tito himself to someone once said that the island swallowed over 1,000 of our men, our fighters. And in this approximation of 1,000 fighters, I don't know if they were counting the women fighters, women partisans, some of whom were also ordained for their bravery in the Second World War and recognized as people's heroes of Yugoslavia. But come what may, this system in this place very quickly pushed this small prison community into absolute savagery. And what started being implemented basically for every subsequent group, apart the first one who came to the island as this empty landscape, as this tabula rasa of a place, were the so-called espaliers, and they were particularly brutal. And I'm going to read to you now two quotes, one by a former male prisoner and one by a former female prisoner, just to paint you a picture of what they went through on this occasion of their welcome beating to the island. So, the male former inmate, I quote, "The great lynching started there. 2,000 people in 2 rows lined up facing each other. The old convicts received the new ones. In that lynch, they beat us, the newcomers. The cries break the air, beat the scum, beat the scum. 2,000 people shout from the top of their lungs, beat the scum. The blows fall on us from everywhere, and there the heads, the arms, and the legs are again broken." Female former inmate. and this is an account that she gave for after the espalier. The unconscious, motionless women lay scattered around. They look like incredible figurines, the works of some sculptor maniac. They all look horrific. The most horrific one is the one with no feet. She's motionless. I'm checking if she's breathing. The rest of them are making strange gargling noises. Around them, tiny little ponds of blood. It lasts. The new ones fall out. I lift my left eyelid with difficulty. I feel it with my hand, and above my eye there is a bulging fist-sized lump growing to close my eye. Prisoners were also malnourished, severely underhydrated. They suffered sunstrokes and sunburns regularly. They suffered from the infectious diseases, and of course, all the while, they were working in the quarries of the island. And they underwent other forms of abuse, such as being given very weird haircuts, especially in the female camp. They were forced to wear uniforms of rags or even old Nazi and Italian fascist uniforms. And this, for some of them who were also survivors of Nazi concentration camps and Italian confinos, was particularly distressing. And the particularly tragic part of this story was that these people and their bodies were both subjects to violence and abuse and the vessels of inflicting violence upon fellow prisoners. And this is why, to some of the former inmates, the double survivors of Nazi camps and of Goli otok, from them we sometimes have the statements that the latter was worse. And though some features of this culture of violence are comparable with other political prisons and forced labor camps, there are things that are truly place-specific, and more to the point, they're island-specific. And this human experience that is inextricable from the island itself and all its features is the core of my interest. So, as part of the political re-education labor program, the inmates were forced to build their own prison out of the very rock of the island. They also forested some of the island's hostile terrain by protecting the tree saplings against the hot Mediterranean sun with the shades of their own bodies. This highly politicized forced labor undertaking under the slogan, "We build Goli otok builds us," had started the extensive changes to the island's biophysical environment. So about the nature of the island, let's say a couple of words about that. It seems at first this nature or the character of the island is this barren place where souls go to die, this non-human entity which built inmates and swallowed warriors. But for the prisoners, this island and its stone was also the source of awe and admiration and even sustenance. For example, this island is less barren than you think. There's shrubbery, there's cacti. These cacti have flowers, and these flowers were used by the prisoners to preserve their teeth because they suffered from the avitaminosis. And although many of them were very young people, obviously, due to malnutrition and all of the abuse that their bodies were undergoing, they were losing teeth, and the cacti stopped that or reversed that at least a little bit. There were seagull eggs that provided some protein sometimes to the starved prisoners. There were mussels on the rocks. There was the haptic contact with stone on which they worked every day. And it's very interesting that both male and female former prisoners sometimes say and claim that this stone has veins, and that they know that the stone has veins because if you find the vein when you try to break the rock, then the rock opens up to you, they say. And if you don't find the vein, you hit at the rock to no avail and then break your own body, break yourself. The island was also used as a tool of policing by the authorities. Of course, the forced labor on the stone itself was mobilized by the police or the prison authorities in this re-education of the inmates. But also some narrative features of the island were also used by the prison authorities as tools. For example, the prison authorities would tell prisoners that there are sharks who patrol these waters, and if they try to run, this is where they're going to end up, in the jaws of the sharks. Of course, the marine biologists who studied the area who I emailed and asked and interviewed for the information, saying there was never many great whites around this area in particular in this particular time for various reasons, a complex set of them. So even the lies or the exaggerations of the Sharkly presence was a tool of the island and about the island to police the prisoners. So the narratives, of course, this is where we arrive now, of this island are also almost a part of the body of this island. And the narratives are volatile, and they are a very interesting pool of sources. Because in the decades following the release and up until Tito's death, the former prisoners, if they tried to have any accounts about their experience, they were both heavily censored and they were reluctantly given. First of all, because of the extent of trauma that they were subjected to, and also because of the governmental suppression of the narrative. And then the violent collapse of the Yugoslav state that came in the 1990s turned the region's focus towards other, more pressing, tragic issues. And over time, the combination of censorship, neglect, and accompanying public rumors, verisimilitudes, fabrications that sort of mixed and muddled with the stories of the prisoners, if any, created this weird Yugoslav political prison folklore. And in it, Goli otok features as the master prison of the so-called Tito's Gulag, an obscure symbol of political oppression and human suffering. The story of Goli otok was also largely underrepresented in the official historiography until the early 2010s. And in the former Yugoslav states, Goli otok today also remains the subject of contrasting forces. On the one hand, there is erasure and oblivion, intersected with attempts at historical revisionism and political instrumentalization by the politicians, of course. And sometimes its political prison past is under attempts to be turned and commodified into a lucrative tourist venture. Of course, this island is now abandoned after the political prisoners were released in the 1956. It was given back to the Croatian state that used it as a prison for the criminally charged felons until 1988, when it was abandoned, left ruined and closed off. And so now it looks a little bit like this. So you have these buildings that are now decaying. And of course, these saplings that the inmates planted long ago are now trees. And what you see on the right here is that the island now is taken over by sheep, because the local shepherds brought the sheep to pasture here. Because of course, this weird island does not have any poisonous snakes, and the reason being is that its terrain is sometimes so salinated that even vipers find it toxic. So they might choke if you put a viper on it. It irritates its venomous glands, so vipers cannot survive on this island. So hence the sheep that live here, that poop here, that die here and decompose here and feed those saplings of trees that grow. And the former prison collapses and people express themselves on its walls, sometimes with a bit too much of an artistic license. And of course there's wild tourism here, where the locals from the nearby inhabited islands are trying to establish this semi-wild dark tourism. Come to Goli otok, the Croatian Alcatraz. And there you have a taxi boat, you have this flyer in 5 European languages. You have a pub there, or at least it was there last time I was there. You can buy a burger, you can buy the beer, you can buy a figurine of a person in a striped uniform. Not that they ever wore striped uniforms, but hey ho. And if you are not inclined to walk up and down this heated island in the midday sun in the summer, you have a colorful little train dragged by tractor that's going to take you there for a fee. And the island itself in that way, and the experience of these people, I believe, is the monument to itself. And that's why I call it the infamous, I think that's self-explanatory, I call it Yugoslav because I think it's quintessentially Yugoslav place. It is a petri dish for examining its most extreme, most concentrated ways that the inter-party schism in the late 40s in Yugoslavia pulled the land in both directions, by the east and by the west. And it created a rupture that I think never actually healed. Prisonscape, the last word of my title here, is of course a word that pertains to a view or a picture dominated by a prison or prisons. And its earliest use was in 18th century by a poet, Charlotte Smith. So today, Goli otok, the prisonscape, is abandoned, decaying old prison complex. So the ideas about turning this prisonscape into a lucrative tourist venture are very creative, and they range from turning the place into an Epicurean resort with organic barbecue, lamb, of course, as the specialty, to branding dark adventure tourism in the crumbling Croatian Alcatraz, or to make it a memorial center that's going to commemorate what these people went through. And true to the label that we've put on this island, it is indeed a prisonscape. It is absolutely dominated by this prison, visually, materially, metaphorically. And now this little island is forever the prison island, the Croatian Alcatraz, if you will. And in fact, I would argue that any island that was ever used as a place of human incarceration, be it in the present or in the past, in human reality, will always remain a prison island. But this island is also dominated by sheep and by the wood that grew from these saplings that prisoners shaded with their own bodies. So it is not maybe just the prison island, and it is not maybe just the prison story. Perhaps it's a story of an assemblage of the human and the island and the prison into the prison island. And us here, as people who are used to thinking in more than human terms, we're aware that there may be lawmakers that are trying to assign the right of personhood in the eyes of the law to rivers or other non-human entities. Or we know maybe about at.on, this ancient figure of English law, which is an inanimate object that, in case it hurts, if a brick falls on a human's head and causes injury, it is effectively put on trial and then given to God, at.on. So we know of these things, and we are used to thinking of more than human or other than human as an agentive, as a responsive co-creator of our world. But as Jane Bennett warns us, we need to be wary of questions of human, non-human, vis-a-vis the politics of blame. Meaning that if we speak of this island that swallowed warriors where souls go to die, we might use the site of the responsibility of the individual people who set this painful assemblage in motion and did nothing for a long time to stop it. And I need to emphasize, though I do hope that this is clear, that of course I'm not saying that something from the stone core of the island had corrupted people's hearts and blurred their judgments and thus plunged them into violence. I'm rather saying something that at first glance seems self-evident, which is that this human experience, this resoundingly embodied experience, is inextricable from the island's nature. And by this I mean from its biophysical environment, from its location in that sea strait, whipped by the winds, and from the insulation by the sun for 200 days, and by its winds, and in less words than that, the island is a complete entity. So I'm saying that the island was a crucial, responsive, vivacious shaper of this experience. And moreover, as a more general point, I would say that oral histories of incarceration, exile, and suffering are inextricable from the places where these human experiences took place. And what this seemingly self-evident notion does, especially to the discourse of Goli otok, within and beyond the former Yugoslav lands, is to make apparent the reality that this experience is irreducible to socio-political and interhuman. And from this I argue that if this camp was set up elsewhere, these people would not go through the same thing, and in turn we would not have the same island in view in front of us today. And this changes everything regarding the writing of this story for me. For example, I approached the interviews as well as the written accounts about Goli otok differently. My set of questions to the former inmates included questions about their sensory experiences, their haptic experiences, their tactile experiences, such as, what do you feel about the stone now? How does a notion of stone make you feel now after this experience? And these people that I talked to, who were 80, in their late 80s when I spoke to them, and in their early 90s, often told me surprising, quite poetic things. I'm going to tell you one of them, one of several that I particularly find moving. This former prisoner told me, I love the stone. I love it. You know, there is this beautiful poem about stone. And then he told me this poem, a poem by a famous Croatian poet called Jure Kaštelan. And it goes like this. This is his paraphrase. It's not the original verse. The original verse is a little bit different. The stone laments, you, masters of the world, free me from the thresholds of dungeons and cathedrals. Bring me the stone back to stone. Let the lightning strike me. Let the night stars look down on me. And you, man with the chisel in hand, wake not the man in me. Bestow me not the face of the man. Do not give me eyes to behold the crime. Now, when we have all this laid out, I think we can talk about why studying prison islands through the lens of environmental humanities is not only a fulfilling scholarly adventure, but also a genuinely insightful pursuit. And to look at islands as laboratories of both natural and societal processes, especially if these were the places of profound human suffering, we can take out the lessons on how to approach the sources that we have, especially if these are the people that we talk to. And perhaps we can use it as a blueprint, and perhaps some other scholars of humanities can do it as well, to include the bio-landscape, the entire picture of the experience into their research as well. So thank you for listening to me, and I hope you have some questions and suggestions. They would be very welcome, and I'm going to talk more to you about it soon. Thanks.